Welcome to the Broken Pie Chart Podcast, episode 57. I'm your host, Derek Moore, and this week, we're going to be talking about the Big Short movie, and more specifically, trying to explain what the heck these credit default swaps, the instrument they keep referencing in the movie. What are they? What do they do? How much do they cost? Who uses these and how would you use them? And honestly, it's not really a retail product. This is a product that large institutions might use. They trade over the counter, a little bit complex. But recently, I watched the movie again. It was on TV, and it's one of those. If you're into finance and if you're into the markets, I think it's a great movie to take a look at. I'll put a link in the show notes to it. But The Big Short was based upon the book by Michael Lewis under the same name. So Michael Lewis is the same author who wrote The Blind Side. I think he wrote The Blind Side. They turned that into a movie. Flash Boys, about the Flash crash. Moneyball, which got turned into a movie starring Brad Pitt, talking about how they used analytics to build baseball teams. And they had a different way of really a quantitative method of looking at how runs are scored and not necessarily just looking at the athletic abilities, but look at the stats behind it. But he wrote the book called The Big Short. And The Big Short came out of the financial crisis. And in the book, he follows around really, I think it's three different entities. One is Michael Burry, who runs a hedge fund, and he bet against mortgages using credit default swaps. Mark Baum. And by the way, Michael Burry in the movie was played by Christian Bale, the same person who played Batman. He was in The Fighter, number of different movies. Mark Baum is played by, so they run a hedge fund. That character is played by Steve Carrell. Of course, Steve Carell was the manager in The Office. And then you have a small, up-and-coming or emerging hedge fund. And I don't remember the actors' names, but that was Brown Capital, I think is who they represented. But they followed these people in the book. And the whole idea is that the Big Short, meaning when you short something, you're betting against it. So you hope that it goes down. And unlike, you buy a stock, you hope it goes up, you buy low, you sell high. You want to sell high and then buy lower, or have an instrument that pays off materially if something goes down. And so it could be a derivative, it could be, I'll explain these credit default swaps and things like that. But the movie follows these people around, and it's kind of interesting. According to the book, Christian Bale, who plays Michael Burry, he wants to bet against housing. And so he wanted to essentially short mortgage bonds. Now, one of the things that they did leading up to, in the early 2000s, it was the early 2000s, it might have been earlier than that, actually. I might be mistaken. But they sort of came to a little more prominence, is the idea that you would securitize mortgages. So what does that mean? It means, let's say you create a bond which contains hundreds or thousands of mortgages, and all these individual mortgages, you package all those up, and you issue this mortgage bond or collateralized obligation, right? And all these mortgages, theoretically, the investor in the bond gets the cash flows from the mortgages, but they also bear the risk if there's material defaults. And there's also an interesting thing too, if rates go down and people close out their mortgages early, you're not defaulting on them, but in essence, you're missing out on some of the cash flows. So back to the movie, The Big Short. So Christian Bale, Michael Burry character, he decides he wants to bet against mortgage bonds. And he goes through and he looks at the underlying positions, meaning each and every bond in some of these mortgage-backed securities. And he decides that, at least the way they portray it in the movie, that a number of these are actually at risk of going bad, that even though they're rated very highly, so when you rate a bond, AAA is the highest rating, highest credit rating for a bond, very likely to pay back and pay back the interest payments. And then you go AA, single A, triple B, double B, single B, and then below B, you wind up with junk, more like junk bonds. So anyway, The he goes in there and he goes to apparently to Goldman Sachs. I think he went to Deutsche Bank, Bear Stearns, Bank of America. I think that's the list. I might be transposing some of those. But essentially what he wants to do is he wants to have a product that would pay off if a lot of these go bad. And so this is where we come into the whole idea of the credit default swap. And it's kind of an interesting name. But before I'll explain what this is and sort of really how it relates to the movie. And by the way, if you could also look at this as sort of a guide if you listen to this and you go watch the movie, you'll be like, oh yeah, okay, I see what that terminology they're using. So basically, let's think about like car insurance. And when you buy car insurance, what do? Well, you pay a monthly premium normally. Usually it's monthly. So you pay this premium. I guess you could pay it off all in one check at the beginning of the year. But let's just say you're paying monthly premiums. And for that premium, you basically insure not only your vehicle, but if you hit somebody else and you're sort of insuring damage on somebody else. But let's just think about your vehicle for a second. So you buy a car, $30,000 car, you pay, $100 a month for your insurance. That's $1,200 a year. If and hopefully there's no injuries or anything, but let's say you parked your car near a cliff and you forgot to put the brake on and your car rolled off the cliff without you in it and your car gets totaled, right? So what happens? Well, the seller of the insurance is on the hook to go and buy you a new car. And so you paid for basically, you put your premiums up, your $1,200 a year, your $100 a month. You total your $30,000 car. Let's say that your car, even though it went off a cliff, it still has, about $2,000 of residual value. I'm making this up, right? But let's say there's some parts in there you could salvage and sell for $2,000. So what happens? In our example here, the insurance company has to replace your car. So, they got to pay $30,000. There's about, what did I say, $2,000 or $3,000? I forget what I said. Let's say $3,000 of residual value. So really, let's say at the end of year one, they took in $1,200 of premium payments, and they also have that salvage value of about $3,000. So if you look at the salvage value and you look at the premiums that was paid, that's $30,000 minus that. They're on the hook for $25,800. Okay. So I bring up the car insurance example because it's sort of similar to what the credit default swap is. It just works a little differently, when you think about it. But conceptually, it's like, okay, you own insurance on your car. And basically, if you total your car, the seller of the insurance is on the hook for it. Now, the reality is the insurance companies are selling car insurance to many, many people, and their probability or their profits come from the fact that the probabilities that people will get into an accident on the same day is very low. And so they're spreading out the risk. The idea is over time, they have to pay out, but the premiums they take in are more than what they have to pay out. So how does this play into a credit default swap? Well, one way of looking at this too is imagine if I could buy sort of insurance that would pay out if you totaled your car. So think about it that way. And that's really what gets into a credit default swap. Imagine your $30,000 car. I could pay premiums, and then if you total your car, I would theoretically get to profit on the difference. And so a credit default swap is similar to that. And so when we think about these products, and again, this could be used, credit default swap or CDS. These are institutional products. Like, don't go out and buy one of these or sell one of these. But they can be used both to hedge a current holding. So you might own something and then you buy this as a hedge. It could also be to speculate on the underlying asset. And the buyers of CDS or credit default swaps, they pay an annual premium. That premium is called the spread. Now, the spread really, whatever the spread is, that refers to what your annual premiums would be. So a lot of times we think about the spread, it might be, the difference between the bid and ask on a stock, or the spread between treasury bond yields and high yield bonds. So when we say the spread on credit default swaps, we're pretty much saying how many basis points, and I'll explain what that means in a second. What's the percentage annual premium you have to pay on this? So the buyers of credit default swaps, they're paid out if the underlying goes bad, loses value, or they have a credit event. And this gets a little bit complicated. And so what a credit event is, it's probably beyond the scope of this. But the sellers are on the hook to pay out on these credit default swaps. And so a little bit more on these, and I'll get back to sort of the movie and the example. So the spread is shown in basis points. And basis points is how we refer to interest rates. So for example, let's say the Fed funds rate, the Federal Reserve, goes from 1% to 1.25%. That 0.25, that 0.25% move, would be considered 25 basis points. So 1% is equal to 100 basis points. So 100 basis points would be 1%. 10 basis points would be worth 0.10%, so a tenth of a percent. And then 1 basis point is equal to 0.01%, so 1/100th. So 0.01, 0.001, and 0.0001. Okay, a little bit of a way to do this. If you see something quoted in basis points, just divide it by 100, and that gives you the percent. In other words, if the spread is 250 basis points, divide that by 100, and pretty much that's 2.5% interest. Okay, but a lot of times you'll hear these referred to as spreads or basis points, and that's kind of what we're talking about. So Michael Burry goes in, and he in the movie he sits down with Goldman Sachs. He says, "Look, I want to bet against these mortgage bonds," and what they say is they agree to sell him some credit default swaps, but he'll have to come up with he'll have to pay premiums either monthly or annually. I forget what it was. And so they came up with basis points or the percent. And basically what happens is now Michael Burry, played by Christian Bale in the movie, is in a contract with Goldman Sachs. And so he pulls out a prospectus. He says, "Hey, these are the bonds, the securities I want to buy credit default swaps on." I think he does $100 million of these. And so basically he has a contract with Goldman Sachs. And so if the underlying bonds go bad, and obviously they taking in some premium, but they would have to pay out potentially a substantial amount if the products go bad. And so he has now a contract with Goldman Sachs. And this is a key point, because one of the things with these credit default swaps that you found out is they had counterparty risk. And he even says this, and they kind of make light of it. He said, he's a little bit concerned about Goldman Sachs' ability to pay out on these in the event the mortgage bonds should fail. And they kind of laugh at him because you think, well, it's Goldman Sachs. How would they not have the money? But when you're buying these, you actually have the ability of the other party in the transaction. They have to have the money to pay out on these. And so, for example, if he would have done one of these with Lehman Brothers, when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, he would have not gotten paid. He might have been able to hedge it in other ways. He could have done a swap buy a credit default swap on Lehman, or he could have, used derivatives on Lehman. But that gets a little complicated. So you do have counterparty risk, and that's why in the movie, I think they spread them around to a couple different investment banks. And one of the challenges for these banks then, when they sold these, and the mortgage bonds started to go bad, that's one of the reasons why the financial crisis was I shouldn't say interesting, but it got a little bit dicey, because you had these firms that all of a sudden were counterparties on these products, and when they went bad, there's a lot of leverage there. And so to kind of explain that, let's say Michael Burry's went in there and said, let's instead of $100 million, let's say he bought $1 million of a CDS credit default swap on these mortgage bonds. And let's say the premium, I think he only paid 20 basis points or 40 basis points, which is less than 1%, right? But let's use this example. Let's say it's 250 basis points was the spread. And that means that divided by 100 is 2.5%. So he buys this $1 million of credit default swaps, and 2.5% on that annually is 25%. Let's say it's a 5-year CDS. And that means for the next 5 years, they own that the credit default swap, $25K a year. So in theory, over 5 years, you pay $125,000. Now, let's say the bonds default and go to zero at the end of year 5. So what does the buyer of the CDS receive? In theory, he gets the $1 million because they've gone to zero and it was $1 million minus the $125,000 paid. So net's about $875,000. So for a little bit of money, wound up with getting paid out a lot. Now, if the bonds don't go bad, well, the problem is he's paying out each and every year. And in fact, there's another scene in the movie where some of his investors come in and start yelling at him because they're like, "What's your monthly carry on this?" And he's he has a lot of these credit default swaps, and he's paying a lot of money in premium. Which, if the event doesn't happen, so somebody can be right about something, but get the timing wrong, and still wind up losing money, even though they were right. So imagine these bonds don't go bad for 5 years. He's paying out all this premiums, 10 years, right? So the reality is that a lot of times, if there's a credit event, bonds might not go to zero. Maybe they're trading at 40 cents on the dollar, right? So they lost 60% of their value. So in that case, same $1 million bonds, if they're trading at 40 cents on the dollar, now they're worth $400,000. So what does the CDS holder theoretically capture? Well, the $1 million minus the $400,000, which is $600,000 minus the $125K they paid over 5 years. So they would net about $475,000. Okay, really simplistic. The way these products work is a lot different. They're over-the-counter markets. It's not like going in and logging into your account and having a bid and an ask. These are traded over the counter. So, but that's kind of a simplified way of looking at it. So if we look at, and I'll put a link to this, CNBC actually has some sample sovereign bonds, current credit default swap spreads. And so here, for example, and I'll link to this, the sovereign bonds, you could buy, well, I'm not saying you, but somebody could buy a German credit default swap 5-year. So that would be on the German sovereign bonds, right? The German, just like U.S. Treasury, but these are German. And those are 8 basis points, a little bit over 8 basis points. So remember, 8 basis points, basically you take the 100 divided by the 8. The 8 basis points divided by 100. And that tells you it's, 0.08%. And so that would be your annual cost if you wanted to bet against, the German 5-year bunds. I guess they're bunds, right? And so one might say too, like, why would wouldn't the German government, wouldn't the European Monetary Association, there's credit default swaps on U.S. Treasuries. Like, couldn't they just print more money? Remember, the other reason you could buy these, I said, again, I don't mean you, but an institution would buy these. Let's say they had a large holding of sovereign bonds. They could get paid out on their long holdings, and then they could buy some of these as insurance, and their net earning is the spread between what they're paying and what they're taking in. But that's essentially the way that these products, and by the way, credit default swaps or swaps are used throughout institutional world. You might have an interest rate swap where, let's say, one company is paying a fixed rate, long-term loan, but their cash flows are really more short-term, so they'd be better off, having a floating rate, short-term, loan. And another company has a floating rate, short-term loan, and they'd be better off from a cash flow standpoint of having a longer-term fixed rate loan. And so in theory, these two companies could enter into an interest rate swap and swap out the long duration, the fixed rate for the short duration floating rate. And it just, for a business reason, it works out better. Two companies could also do a currency swap where somebody needs euros and somebody else needs dollars, and they can enter into a swap. So these are products that are used in the institutional world, and they could be used to hedge. They could also be used to speculate. But bringing it back to the movie, one of the there's an interesting point too towards the end of the movie, where Mark Baum, played by Steve Carrell from The Office, the guy from The Office, the manager, he goes in and he's talking to somebody. I think it was Morgan Stanley, and apparently they had taken some losses on, some of these credit default swaps, and the woman was telling him they actually had a trader who bought triple B's and double B credit default swaps. So those are lower rated mortgages. And Steve Carell originally was like, hey, that's great. They're smarter than I thought, right? But it turns out they actually sold double A's, single A's, and double A's. Could be double A's and triple A's, but they sold A's to collect the premium to help finance their cost of paying the premiums on their long, the ones they own, the credit default swaps. And the losses were much greater on the ones that they sold because they didn't think the higher rated ones would ever go bad like they did. And there's a whole thing in the movie about that. So it is interesting, though. I did some, internet research, I'll call it. And it's kind of interesting. I found some during the financial crisis, for example, Iceland, where Iceland had some sovereign issues and debt issues and things like that. And July of 2007, their 5-year credit default swaps on Iceland bonds, right? They were at 5.3 basis points. And then at one point they went up to, 1,473 basis points. What that means is they went from an annual premium, if you wanted to bet against these, of 0.05% to almost 15% on an annual premium basis. And you can see there's a couple charts if you search online. I also looked and I found, for example, AIG. AIG was a company, my understanding is they were involved in some of these derivative products and swaps and collateralized debt obligations, things like that. They actually went from a low of 68 basis points, which is, a little over 0.5%, right? To a high of 3,500 basis points. So that would mean if you wanted to buy a credit default swap on AIG, you would have to pay about 35% of the value over a year buying it, at that. And then I think I also saw, I don't have it handy, but there was one where Bear Stearns, of course, Bear Stearns never went bankrupt theoretically. They just arranged a buyout to J.P. Morgan. Lehman actually did go bankrupt. So these are sort of interesting products. And recently, somebody had watched the movie, The Big Short, and they were asking about these. And so I thought it'd be interesting to do an episode on credit default swaps. They're not really understood. I would say I wouldn't recommend going out and buying any of these or selling any of these. Remember, if you sell these, you take in some premium, but you're on the hook for losses. And these get a little bit complicated as far as when they pay out. And it's not like buying a stock. It's not. So this is more of a professional product, but. I would encourage everyone, if you haven't seen the movie The Big Short, I would read the book, but I know not everyone wants to spend the time reading a book because there's a lot more detail. But if you watch the movie, it's kind of interesting when they talk about credit default swaps and paying the premiums and basis points and tranches and double A's and single A's and double B's and triple B's. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more insight. And so if you watch the movie, maybe you listen to this and then watch it again, or maybe you listen to this and you watch the movie if you haven't. So anyway, all right, folks. Once again, thanks for listening. Keep the comments coming via the email. You can go to razorwealth.com and hit up the contact me section. Also, please send me ideas for future episodes, or if there's any guest you'd like to, if somebody wants to guest on here, that's something we're going to be doing a little bit more of. So with that, rather than waste time rating, reviewing, and starring, go ahead and share this with somebody. Pass along the link to the back episodes and this episode, and encourage somebody to listen to it if they think it's valuable. And with that, we'll see you all next week.